You are a monster, deathly, solipsistic to the bone, and you're blasphemous because all you want is you. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 15 in season 3, and we are talking about serial killers. So in our last episode, which was our first episode on this new theme of serial killers that we're taking on, we talked not necessarily why serial killers scare us, because as Matt pointed out, well, I think Lisa pointed out originally, and then Matt mentioned in the episode that we know why serial killers scare us just because they kill people. And we did talk a bit, though, about how we're still, even though we're terrified of serial killers, fascinated by them. So we talked a little bit about the kind of strange celebrity that serial killers get, from nicknames to documentaries about them to people riveted on their trials. We talked a little bit about unsolved serial killer murders like Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac, just kind of talking about how these stories get going. And if I remember correctly, we even talked a little bit about how maybe why we don't follow these things as much in this 24-hour news cycle that we're in today. So if you're interested in this topic, that was kind of our beginning, where we talk about okay, why is this fascinating us, and how does a crossover happen between real life stuff with this topic and horror fiction? So similar to how we did our cult theme of episodes, which was the theme we took on before this one. We started talking about cults in general. Then we talked about fictional cults. Then we talked about real cults. We're kind of following that structure right now. So in this episode, we will be talking a bit about fictional serial killers. So we'll be doing film and fiction in this particular episode. So Lisa, I know you did some of the structuring of our notes for this episode, and particularly that intro quote that you read. So I'm going to kind of pitch it to you to get us started on our discussion here.
Yeah, well, the opening quote I pulled from a book that I really like, and that is You by Carolyn Kepnes. And it has probably one of the best killers in, I don't know, that I've read recently, at least, in Joe Goldberg. Now, if y'all don't know, it is a book, and then it was turned into a TV series that is now, I think it first ran on Lifetime, and now it's on Netflix. And then she has a sequel out to it called Hidden Bodies, which kind of follows Joe's story. So the first one is set in New York. And it's really great because he's a bookstore owner, and so he's kind of watching all these people coming in and out of his store, and you get to see New York through his eyes, and he's often very sarcastic, and kind of there's a lot of dark humor there, which is fun to read. And then the sequel, Hidden Bodies, goes to Los Angeles, and so that world is just ripe for that kind of dark humor, sarcasm, irony. But then again, I'm sitting here talking about how much I love this character, and he's also a killer. And so I thought it really worked to illustrate the point, Mel, that you were talking about, which is that I think I can say we, being the collective we here, that we are very fascinated by serial killers, and not just from a like a true crime sort of way either, where there's just this kind of distance to, where you're kind of wondering what's going on in their head, what went wrong in their life to make them do what they did, what makes them tick, that sort of thing. But almost, Mel, you use the word celebrity, and there is a celebrity that kind of goes along with it, because often they have very charismatic personalities that are attractive to people. And if they don't, then they usually have some sort of very interesting story that's been built around them. And this is not anything recent. I mentioned You and Hidden Bodies, which, is relatively recent, but Mel, you brought up when we were getting ready, getting our notes together for this, that we've been creating the fictional serial killer for quite a while, and one of the first ones that at least we could find, I'm sure there's some that go back before this, but the first movie version was Fritz Lang's 1931 film M, starring Peter Lorre as the killer. So they're very kind of charismatic, but that one I believe is based on um, an actual serial killer from the time. So the Vampire of Dusseldorf, or Peter Curtin, and I won't go into detail with Peter Curtin's deal. Y'all, you can Google him. He's gross. I don't care to talk about it, but um, Mel, I know you had told me that kind of in the writing of the movie M that there was a lot of research that went into it, based on several different serial killers cases.
Yes, when we were doing research for this particular episode, I was looking around trying to see like what the earliest serial killer movie would be, because I know in our notes we had well, we had several, but we had Psycho in there, which was Robert Bloch's novel, but became Hitchcock's 1960 movie. But of course, then I remembered Shadow of a Doubt, Hitchcock's 1943 kind of serial killer movie. And so in my Googling, I discovered that, as you said, Lisa, Fritz Lang's M is usually seen as kind of the original serial killer movie. There may have been one earlier, but that's the one people kind of look at. I found a couple articles that kind of called it the blueprint for the serial killer movie. And so when I was reading articles about it, this is where Peter Lorre plays a killer, as you mentioned, who targets children, girls in particular. And a couple of the things that critics have noted about it is that one of the ways they try to track this guy down is by using fingerprinting, which was, as far as I could tell from reading, a relatively new kind of way of tracking criminals. So you have this kind of modern police work going on while you're following this, I guess, modern killer in a way. Because I think we talked about last time how we didn't even have the term for serial killers until like the 60s or the 70s, and this is 1931. But they also did intensive research, not just on policing, but on the killers themselves. So Lang co-wrote the script with his wife, Thea von Harbo, I think would be how you would pronounce it. I apologize if I'm wrong on that. They also worked on the movie Metropolis together, which we talked about. I believe we talked about Metropolis in our series on robots. So listeners, if you're interested in that, we watched Metropolis and talked a little bit about that in one of our previous series. But she, well, I'm assuming both of them did this, but they met with a number of killers who we would think of now as serial killers, like you mentioned, Lisa, including the Dusseldorf vampire, Peter Curtin. I didn't get any other names in the articles I was reading of the other killers that they interviewed, but they used that information that they got from talking to these various people to kind of create this killer that Peter Lorre inhabits. The other thing I thought was interesting when I was reading these articles is that it turns out that in the movie, one of the interesting things is that the other criminals, like the criminal underworld, kind of pursue this guy as well, partially because, I guess, of the nature of his crime, but also because of the higher police scrutiny that's going on because of this as well. So there's various kind of interesting movements and developments that are going on in this movie that, even though it came out in 1931, the articles that I read said watching it, it feels modern, because in a way it's kind of not predicting, but it's taking this kind of composite of these killers and creating almost like a model for what now we just say, oh yeah, I'm watching like a TV show like Castle or Psych or something. Yes, that's a serial killer. But at the time they were kind of creating this composite, I guess might be the best way to put it.
You know, one thing that I find really fascinating in looking at that as maybe the first modern um, serial killer movie. Like you said, Mel, maybe not the exact first one, because there's probably quite a few that would predate it, maybe not as well known. now that I'm thinking. But you see some of these elements that make it fascinating. Number one, the idea of a police hunt and kind of an investigation. But Mel, as you brought up, that they're bringing in kind of the modern technology, which I think a lot of these best shows do, is bring in the you get to see the new technology. So in that case, it would have been fingerprinting. Um, but I don't think it was. I, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the dates to back this up, but I would imagine that when things like DNA testing were coming out, that there was probably a big uptick in books and TV shows and things that involved that kind of technology because people find it fascinating. So, I mean, we're kind of seeing more things than just the killer itself that's bringing people to this particular genre because it's the police investigation, it's the new fancy technology getting used in a really interesting way. um and also kind of you get to see, I think, the best of them, and M may have done this too. But kind of the best of them will show how society is reacting to this kind of evil that's going through it, right? Because it's never just about, I mean, some of them are just kind of cat and mouse games with the detective and the killer, but a lot of them, like I think we've talked about Zodiac in the past, kind of show the effects of um and Son of Sam, that's another good one. But it can kind of show the effects of these crimes on society and how people react.
Yeah, apparently the end of the movie focuses on the parents, and there's like this interesting look at how the society, how people are reacting to the fact that there's a killer amongst them. Which, yeah, like you mentioned, Lisa, we talked about how that's the case in Son of Sam. That, even though you're kind of following the killer in M, it's about like what the criminal element thinks about what's going on with the police. It's about the police trying to find this guy. It's about the I hate to use this word per se, but it's the word that's coming to mind, like the hysteria, because people are terrified and trying to protect their children. Um, and so you have this kind of mass of fear and emotion going on in this movie that, yeah, I think you're right. It anticipates a lot of that kind of societal impact that we think of with a serial killer movie today.
Well, I'd like to maybe maybe shift the focus just because I want to ask a question to both of y'all here because I think you're right that this is a very very foundational sort of work in terms of, like you said, setting the blueprint for so many of these serial killer stories. But what do y'all think about how about well uh, I'll just go ahead and break the seal on a Hannibal Lecter here, and the reason why, because I mean he is one of those big serial killers, and he's one of those like elephant in the room for this sort of like episode. But the reason why I ask is, I mean, I'll skip over Red Dragon just because Hannibal Lecter wasn't really a pop culture touchstone until the movie Silence of the Lambs came out, even though he was featured in the book and they did a really bad adaptation of it before they went back and did it later as a film. But Silence of the Lambs, the movie comes out, wins several Oscars, deservedly so. Anthony Hopkins in particular, haunting portrayal of Hannibal Lecter. But Silence of the Lambs itself is more about, like what you were just saying, the sort of almost the police procedural, the investigation, and how Jodie Foster's character is, hunting this other serial killer and has to use the demented mind of Hannibal Lecter to try to find this other active serial killer. But from then on out, Hannibal Lecter became the focus. I mean, so much so that Thomas Harris's next two novels centered entirely around Hannibal. I mean, the next book, which became the next movie, was literally just called Hannibal. And the focus shifted from the police proceeding, police procedural, into following Hannibal Lecter. Like, he went from villain to almost anti-hero of sorts. Like, what do you two think about that? Because I don't know. I feel like that was kind of the template for later things like Dexter, which we can talk about in depth a little bit later. But actually viewing the point of view of the serial killer, like, I don't know, it's a very broad and big question, but it just kind of jumped into my mind as you were both talking about M.
Yeah, Dexter popped into my mind when you were saying that because it's like Hannibal is like kind of on the side of the police going after another serial killer, right? How maybe that layer changes it slightly.
I guess, but
Yeah.
like the next one is really more following him, and yes, there's the hunt to kind of catch him now that he's free and on the loose, but a lot of it is very much like here's Hannibal and he's going after this like disfigured, disabled victim of his that survived or something like that. It's been a while,
Hmm.
but I don't know. I mean, he becomes the main character, and you're almost forced in a lot of ways to identify with him in a way that makes him, if not relatable, at least slightly sympathetic, because you get his backstory about how he was forced into cannibalism as a young child, and all the horrible traumatic events that happened in his childhood. It almost becomes this, well, hey, let's make him more sympathetic, which is, I don't know, it's a weird
Bonkers.
thing. It's pardon.
Bonkers.
A little bit. A little bit, if you ask me. I mean, I always found the character of Hannibal Lecter very interesting, and I remember when Hannibal came out, the book, and I read the book, and I was a little disappointed by it for a number of reasons. But yeah, I don't know, but this idea of taking a serial killer and making them into sort of some sort of slightly sympathetic thing is, I think that's a much more recent thing, starting with maybe the mid to late 90s up until now with Hannibal and Dexter and a few other things that we can probably talk about. But I guess I'm trying to pinpoint why the shift. Was it because obviously Thomas Harris, the author of those books, was very interested in exploring the psyche of Hannibal further, and people were willing to go along with him. The book was a bestseller, and then they made a movie out of it. Movie didn't do as well, but you know it was popular enough for them to option it and make it.
Yeah, I don't. This is a really odd thing, and I don't know. I have ideas, and I don't know if I can. All right. Well, I think number one, your first question is kind of when did we make that shift? Because if you look at somebody like, I'm just using M as an example, okay? Because in the movie, the serial killer he's targeting little girls, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Which and that's why I think like the Peter Curtin thing is probably, even if they looked at more people, they were modeling it mainly after him because I know he had a lot of crimes that involved children and girls. And that is so despicable, and so you see it and that okay, that's an evil person. But then at some point, you know, flash forward a few decades and we've got Hannibal Lecter, and I think everybody would agree we love Hannibal Lecter. Matt, for all the reasons that you were giving. And even if you just look at the original, and I'm talking about the movie Silence of the Lambs there, because I think you're right, Matt. I think that's the one where he really entered the popular culture was with that film, even though there were books and movies previous to that. Um, that movie Silence of the Lambs, you have Hannibal Lecter up against another serial killer, and that serial killer would have made a great story. Buffalo Bill would have made a great story movie on his own, but it's not his fault that he was put in the same movie with Hannibal Lecter, and he kind of like dulls in comparison, um, because Hannibal Lecter is a fascinating character, and I understand why people would want to dig into the brain of him and kind of understand and want a prequel. I just as a reader, I don't enjoy prequels. I don't need the full backstory of why is the bad guy doing it. I don't need that. I read it. It was fine. It was interesting, but I didn't need it. And it didn't change my feelings about Hannibal. I didn't suddenly see him as a sympathetic character. To me, he's still a killer, although he's a very charismatic killer. But I think to answer your question, like, when did that shift happen where you have just a serial killer being kind of pure evil walking the face of the earth, a true monster, to Hannibal Lecter, somebody that we quote, somebody that we root for when we watch him on the screen. And by the way, just kind of as a little aside for us, at some point we are going to have a debate between the three of us over who plays the best Hannibal Lecter. But will withhold that because that might take up the rest of the episode. But I'm wondering, would you guys think that a character from maybe from Psycho might be that turning point where you still recognize the character as a monster, but it's somebody who you root for, who, I don't know if you want to use the word anti-hero, or it may just be, I mean, that's the hero of the movie. Kind of in the same way Hannibal is. I mean, Dexter marks a separate shift, but I think if we're tracing the lineage there, that maybe Psycho might be the next stop to get us to a Hannibal Lecter.
I think so. I think you're right. I wouldn't put Norman Bates quite in the same category as Hannibal Lecter in terms of sympathetic or even relatable, I guess. But yeah, I guess the movie is more from his view, I guess, than anything else, because I mean, the what's the character's name? The woman who steals the money. I cannot remember the character's name. I'm just drawing a blank. But Janet Leigh, whoever.
Yeah, I was about to say I can't think of anything other than her actor name.
Well, whatever. I mean, because the movie starts off and it seems like it's going to be about her, but I mean, she's, spoiler, killed pretty quickly, and then the rest is about kind of Norman Bates and everything else. So I mean, I guess that would be the next stop on the way to Hannibal Lecter, as you put it.
Well, I guess here's my thing, and I'm just gonna nitpick something you just said, because you said sympathetic, like with Hannibal. And here's the thing that I have with Hannibal Lecter, and maybe that I do with Norman Bates as well. I find them both despicable for what they do, right? And to me, they're both monsters. Like, whatever they went through in their past, they're monsters. They're monsters now. And there's nothing redeemable about them, and that's okay. But I still root for them. Like, when I watch it, I still root for them. Like, I don't root for any of the women who go into the hotel, the motel. I'm fine with him winning in the end, and that's kind of the same thing when I watch like Hannibal. I'm rooting for him to get his guy, so to speak. I don't know, and that's, I think that is the kind of strange shift from watching it being something that's scary and that's a thriller of, oh my gosh, there's this scary guy out there, there's this monster out there, how are these people going to get away, to, okay, I really like these killers and I want them to succeed.
I honestly think, because like our planning notes for this episode, not to give too much of a peek behind the curtain, we're a little bit kind of scattered of just kind of thoughts here and there, but I think the linchpin is kind of those, what I think it was you pointed out in the notes, Lisa, was the slashers from the 70s and 80s. And follow me with, or bear with me for a moment while I kind of follow this rabbit down a hole, because I don't know that this is, I don't want to make this out to be like some sort of truth, but I think it's a possibility that, you've got Michael Myers in Halloween in particular coming out in the late 70s, and I wonder if the slasher movies began as sort of a reaction to this explosion of serial killers in the media, at least in the 70s. I mean, we've already talked about Son of Sam and the Zodiac Killer and several others, Ted Bundy, all active in the late 70s. But then as the slasher genre develops throughout the 80s with Freddy Krueger and Jason and all of them, I mean, once you start getting into the third, fourth, and fifth sequels, all the people that they're killing just are almost disposable, and almost the protagonist. I won't use the word sympathetic, but I will just say that the main character, if you will, does become the killer. Freddy Krueger, Jason, Michael Myers. So, I mean, do you think that could be kind of where that shift began, was with the slasher movies in general? Because, I mean, by the time you're watching, like, you know, the fifth Friday the 13th, all the kids are fairly disposable. You know somebody's going to live, but most of them are going to die, and you're more just wondering how they're going to die and what they're going to do to kill Jason and how he'll come back for Friday the 13th part 6, right?
Well, you know, that you're absolutely right, because honestly, and I would even make the case that, for instance, for any of the Friday the 13th Jason movies, the campers are quite literally faceless. I mean, you know what? They're campers and camp counselors. You know, um, their plot line, their storyline, their character arc, none of that matters. They are there to be killed, right? Unless the only thing, and kind of the same thing with like a Leatherface killer. It's the same thing. It's like, you know, it's always going to be a group of kids who get lost out in the backwoods of Texas. But their story really doesn't matter that much. Really, the only time that you get, I think, a character, and this kind of goes back to maybe like a Hannibal Lecter, because, you know, y'all mentioned with Silence of the Lambs how Hannibal is matched with Clarice. And so you have a well matched kind of opposition between the good guy and the bad guy. And really, you know, you think about something like Halloween and Michael Myers. You have Jamie Lee Curtis's character, of course, who she's the only one that you remember, because I feel like she's the only one who you're supposed to remember, because she's there to battle him. Like, that's her role. Everybody else is just there to be picked off one by one. But let's face it, when you talk about slasher films, which essentially, even though we call them slashers, Matt, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they fit in this line of serial killers. But who do you remember? You remember Freddy Krueger. You remember Michael Myers. You remember Ghostface from Scream. You know, even as you move into the new millennium with a movie like The Strangers, and you have those doll-faced masked killers. I mean, those movies are built around that big, charismatic personality of the killer, right? It's, I don't know, it's really interesting, because at some point, the other characters really don't matter. They're just there to be mowed down.
I'm wondering if there's some connection between what's going on with these fictional serial killers and some of the stuff we talked about in the last episode, with kind of the focus on the killer of real life serial killers, how they become, I guess, for lack of a better term, use the one we used earlier, a celebrity. Whereas, as you pointed out in the last episode, Lisa, sometimes we don't necessarily remember all the victims. We know there were a lot of victims of, say, like Ted Bundy, but we were thinking about him in this particular moment. And I mean, I don't know that slashers are a meditation on that, but I think it's interesting how, as audiences watching fictional things, we focus on that charismatic person, whether it's just because they're charismatic or they're central, or it's because we're interested in their psychology. I mean, maybe that, I don't know, maybe it's just weird. I don't know, maybe I'm going off into a tangent, but it seems like a weird kind of borderland or back and forth between like reality and fiction, I guess, like a mirroring there in a way.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think the fiction of the time period does kind of mirror cultural events, but then cultural events are also influenced by the fiction of the time period. It's kind of a two-way street there. So, yeah.
Well, I think you're right. Even just when you were talking about kind of like the psychology of why we're fascinated behind it, but but with these, I just mentioned off a few characters from like Leatherface, for instance, or Ghost. Is it a Ghost Face? Is that what we're supposed to call the killer in Scream?
I think so, but I'm
That's what
not
I've always.
sure.
Okay.
That's what I,
Um,
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
okay, well, I mean, you have these characters, and they're so iconic. They're so larger than life. I mean, you can't see, a red striped sweater without thinking Freddy Krueger, or like a hockey mask, when not think some of these killers. But when you think about it, and you think about like the way we report about real life serial killers and the way we talk about them, and often what do? We give them names, right? Um, Son of Sam, Zodiac, BTK, and it's almost as if we start building stories around them before we even know who they are. And it's the same thing that's happening in these movies, that we're building, whether or not we get a full prequel like we did with Hannibal Lecter, but we're building a mythos around these characters. And I don't know fully why that is, and why that draws us in, but that's what we're doing. You know, I don't know if it's us trying to understand the way evil works so that it makes us feel better and safer somehow. Like if we know how it works, then we can keep ourselves safe from it. Or if it's just kind of one of those questionings of just, I don't know, the need to know, because we've talked about this in past episodes, that the unknown is so terrifying. And so just to say somebody is killing just to be killing, that our mind can't really reconcile that. And by giving these people stories and making them a character, that's kind of, they have their idiosyncrasies, and they have their particular way of dressing, or they, whatever, they have a story that goes along with them. Maybe it feels like we're making sense of something that really doesn't have any sense behind it.
I think you're 100% right on that. I think a lot of the stories, and I mean, I'm going to move away from slashers a little bit in what I'm saying here, but just the stories that we have behind our fictional serial killers, so many times they do have some kind of a backstory, some sort of traumatic triggering event that caused this. Um, we keep mentioning Dexter, but Dexter would be a great one because of the traumatic event he had as a child, where he was, his left in a cargo container with his mother, who had been killed with a chainsaw by, I think it was a drug cartel or something. But even the serial killer of the week on like Criminal Minds, or like you said, Psych, or any of these kind of shows, a lot of times there is something at work in their childhood. They were abused, they had a traumatic event, there was something. And I think you're right, that is trying to make sense out of what makes these people the way they are, because so often serial killers in real life, we don't get that sort of closure or explanation. And I don't know the backstory of all the serial killers out there by any stretch, but the Ted Bundy is kind of on, still in the forefront of my mind because of that recent Netflix documentary. And one thing that kind of stood out to me while watching it was that, like, he had a fairly normal childhood, by most accounts, like even by his own account. Like his parents were not like physically abusive, they weren't mentally abusive. He didn't have any sort of traumatic event that triggered anything. And if you really want to delve deeper, it's almost like he was just born broken. But in our fiction, when we talk about serial killers, like, that's not always the case. Sometimes the serial killer just is, but most of the times, like, there's we have to have a reason for it, because I think so many of us are just uncomfortable with the idea that someone could just be born that way. I mean, I'm uncomfortable thinking about it just right now as I'm talking about it, because I don't want to admit that that's a possibility. That's terrifying, that there could be people out there that have no reason for wanting to just murder people. That's scary. So I think you're completely right about needing to have a reason and an explanation for why they are the way they are.
Well, yeah, and I think when you look at the characters, because of course we've talked about Hannibal Lecter and Dexter Morgan, because they were, I guess, still are kind of so part of the public culture, and they were so long running, with audiences getting to know the characters, and those are kind of perfect examples because not only do we have kind of a backstory for both of those for why they do what they do, um, I think we also get kind of this idea of they still operate within a certain morality in their worlds, um, which kind of reinforces the fact that we feel okay rooting for them. Um, Dexter, of course, has his code, right? Where he will only kill uh well, I mean, he kills other serial killers, and that's a pretty great premise right there, right? A serial killer who only kills other serial killers. Um, and so you can kind of applaud that because you're like, well, he almost fits into like the vigilante um storyline, and that's something that people enjoy. It's almost like a Wild West type story when you follow him. But Hannibal Lecter, even though we may not fully understand it, he has his own kind of code, right? He has his own reasons for why he goes after certain people. They've wronged him in some sort of way, or they're not worth anything to him, but it seems to me that even with a person like Hannibal, he's choosy as to who he kills. There's a line in one of the movies where he says something like, I gave a lot of thought to eating your wife or something like that. But where he's, it's obvious he has a plan. He's not just running out there just ruthlessly killing. And I think that is one of the things that allows us to watch characters like this and kind of, I mean, dare I say, like, fall in love with these characters, because I think people, I mean, like, especially Dexter, people loved watching Dexter and kind of rooting for him in his real life. And it's the same thing with Hannibal. People love Hannibal, right? That's why he's been the subject of so many books and movies and TV shows. And Matt, as you mentioned, how you can kind of see how the books have kind of morphed to shift their focus onto him, whereas before they were maybe just kind of straight up not true crime, just crime novels or crime thrillers, and then they kind of shifted to just focus on Hannibal. And I think that's part of it. I think because you know what, a serial killer without that sense of morality or without rhyme or reason, I think that's the truly terrifying ones. And I think those are the ones that we don't spend a lot of time on because we can't. They terrify us. So they're going to be the one-off movies. They're not going to be the sequels.
And in the end, they're going to get caught. Like,
oh,
that's why it's a one-off movie. Yeah, they have to be caught or killed. Caught or killed.
Or killed, right? Absolutely. Well, no, I mean, you think about some of these that are really terrifying, and I think you start, and this is where you start to really see things kind of shift. But you mentioned the slasher movies of like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. By the time you pass 2000, you have movies. I mentioned The Strangers, but there was also the Funny Games, both the original and the remake, which both kind of hit upon that, where it's killers who, number one, I mean, they're charismatic only to the sense of we wonder about them, because in Funny Games, they're really just seemingly normal teenage boys. And in The Strangers, that's your typical, I mean, these are both home invasion movies, but they're also slasher films. But you have, these masked killers, and you know nothing about the killers except they're wearing masks. That's all you get, So it's not like a fully fleshed out story like Dexter or Hannibal. but they can't be because we can't feel any sort of sympathy for them because they're doing what they're doing seemingly for the joy of it and for no rhyme or reason. They're terrifying. Although those two kind of break your rule, Matt, because I don't think either one of them are caught in the end.
True.
But my point is I think you would have a hard time making a case for making a series out of any of those killers because that's too terrifying to kind of wade into that territory. Like we need to have serial killers that we understand that they have a set of rules that they work by.
I don't know how this would fit in, but I was thinking how Psycho and Shadow of a Doubt kind of are both sides of your conversation that you guys are having. But I mean, I don't know. We may not want to go back into since we're in the 90s and the 2000s, we may not want to go back.
Well, I did. I mean, this. I hope I'm not dragging us too off topic, but you mentioned kind of looking back a little bit, and as we were compiling this list, I was looking at a lot of like Hitchcock films, and wondering which ones we could sneak in under the serial killer banner, I guess. But I was thinking about the movie Rope, and
Oh yeah.
but I didn't know. I mean, I was like, well, I guess that's kind of really only one killing, but I don't know. I feel like that was kind of an example of where we're looking at, if not serial killers, then very much potential serial killers. And it seems to be much more focused on them and their ideas and their inner workings than anything else.
No, I can totally see that as potential. It's like you're almost seeing the very beginnings of someone being capable of doing something like that. I was thinking while you were talking about the two different kinds of serial killers about how you have Shadow of a Doubt, the Hitchcock movie from 1943, where the uncle is just evil. Like he hates widows. He just wants to get their stuff and then kill them. And he's like a serial marrier murderer. And he seems totally normal and quote unquote and charming and everything we talked about last week. But if I remember correctly, there's no ever explanation of him except he's trying to get stuff from these women and kill them. But I feel like I remember him describing to his niece how a person like this would just see these people as disposable. There's no real explanation of how someone who apparently grew up the way he did or is loved by his niece and everybody else could do something like this. But then you have something like Psycho where, you go into the actual, like, why he would have done this. And of course, Shadow of a Doubt doesn't really go anywhere other than the guy getting killed at the end. Spoiler from 1943. But Psycho, I mean, we have the new, what was it, a year or two ago where they continued it with Bates Motel.
Bates Motel, yeah.
And there's this kind of like re-entry into the psychosis or the psychology of a person like that. Like it's like Psycho seemed to be able to go from book to movie to series later on. Whereas someone like the Uncle in Shadow of a Doubt or the kids in Rope, it's like, oh, well, this is how they start out, or this guy, this is his MO, but we don't understand why, and we don't ever follow up on it.
Yeah, again, I think that people, if you're gonna have a successful serial killer series, it has to be, it has to be a very charismatic person. It has to have a very good and involved backstory. And I mean, let's not forget, because by the time you get to like the 90s, which, I know we're jumping in time a lot here, but you get increasingly creative. And we even saw that with Hannibal, right? Because Hannibal started getting really creative in how he killed people. Feeding to pigs and hanging people out of windows by their guts, and it's not just Hannibal the cannibal where he's just killing people and serving them up for dinner. He's getting really creative with that. And that leads us right into things like Seven, where you have a serial killer doing, reenacting the seven deadly sins, or you have something like, why am I blanking? the Saw movies, the Jigsaw killer, where you have these like crazy contraptions and people in. So then it becomes, it's almost like the way the killings and the murders are acted out are an extension of the serial killer's personality and story too, if that
Right.
makes any sense. So it's not just going to be a killing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And not just that too. I'd say, since you brought up Seven, I would almost use that as a jumping off point to kind of bring in the web of what I keep calling the Ashley Judd movies from the 90s, because she was in several of those like serial killer type movies, none of which were connected to one another. But she's not the only one. Angelina Jolie was in The Bone Collector. There's always some sort
J
of
Lo did The
yes,
Cell.
The Cell. That's that. I was going to mention that. But
Yeah.
what I always find interesting about those ones is that in all of those, and I wouldn't say that Seven was the starting off place for this, but it's definitely a prominent one, is there's this cat and mouse game between the killer and the detectives. Like the killer knows that the detectives are chasing him and or her, and there's like this tit for tat back and forth kind of thing. In real life, I mean, that's never the case. I think in just a few instances have serial killers been so brazen and open as to go like maybe to a bar and talk to police officers there just about the killings in general, but it's never been as blatant as something like Seven or any of these other like 90s sort of serial killer movies where the killer knows that they're being tracked, and not just being tracked but by these specific detectives, so they'll leave clues specifically for them, or like I don't know what to do with that or what to make of it, but it's definitely worth pointing out, I guess.
Well, in the one movie where Ashley Judd is the serial killer, if I'm remembering right, the police officer's like stalking her, right? I mean, he starts focusing on her and following her around, not necessarily to solve the mystery.
I think so, yeah.
Mm.
I don't know.
But that's kind of, I mean, by the time you get to the end of Hannibal's story, Clarice is kind of.
Oh, let's not talk about Clarice's
Yeah.
Stockholm syndrome, because that's all it can be. That's what I was alluding to when I was saying I was very let down by the Hannibal book, because I felt like, okay, listeners, you're going to get the full soapbox on it now that we've really broached the topic, but like I was okay with the Hannibal book until that happened, until she chose to go with Hannibal, and it was explained away as her like actually choosing to be with him. I'm like, no, either it's Stockholm syndrome or this is a BS ending, and I'm leaning towards the latter.
Yeah, but didn't you know it was just all a love story waiting to happen?
I cannot sigh loudly enough.
Yeah, it did. I mean, like I said, I didn't need that book. I didn't need that movie, so.
Getting to see Ray Liotta's brain in the movie was kind of funny, but
that was a fun scene.
um,
Well, I'll say this, guys. I don't think we're ever gonna really figure out what is so fascinating about serial killers, or what draws us into their world and makes us want to be a part of it, because it's a strange addiction to say the least. But it's there. And I think one thing that we've learned in talking about this, and we will continue this discussion of kind of our fascination with serial killers, because it's too broad to do in just one episode. But one thing we've learned is that there's a lot. I mean, we've mentioned a lot of different types, everything from, Freddy Krueger to Scream to Dexter Morgan to Hannibal Lecter. And then we didn't even mention like the outliers in this genre, which those are there too, like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, which is another, again, kind of fascinating character study. That's just, yeah, it's just interesting because he's another one of those kind of anti-heroes that fits into like a satire almost. And then, of course, the hitman in No Country for Old Men, which is on the other side of it. Not quite a charismatic character, but just downright terrifying. I mean, that coin toss may be one of the most terrifying moments in movie history. So it is a really broad genre, and it can be as varied as the different serial killers. Which kind of brings me back to my favorite, which is Joe Goldberg. I read an interview with Caroline Kepnes, and she said when she had written the book, I think one of her friends had commented, like, I can't believe you wrote a book about a serial killer. And her response was, I didn't write a book about a serial killer. And then she said she thought for a minute and she was like, oh, well, I guess he does kill a lot of people. Which I found kind of funny and charming. And it fits with the character in the book too, is you want to root for this guy. You want him to do well. I think because you're spending so much time in his head, and he seems so normal at times, and he seems to want what everybody wants, which, is just to be happy and to live his life and to have his career and read a few books and date a pretty girl. And, there are a lot of dead bodies that kind of collect along the way. And yeah, I think that just really exemplifies kind of our feeling about serial killers, is they seem so normal up until the point where you realize, oh my gosh, they're not. They're completely and utterly monstrous. And that is one of the really fascinating things, because we've covered a lot. We've covered robots, and we've covered vampires, and we've covered ghosts and spiritualism. And serial killers is one of those things that you look at and you think, okay, this is one of those monsters that is as close to me as I could really get. And that's both fascinating and terrifying, and a very uncomfortable space to be in. But I think it at least begins to shed a light on why we are so fascinated by serial killers. I'll just go ahead and say that I prefer mine to be fictional. I don't really care to hear about the real life ones as much anymore, but I will welcome Hannibal and Dexter and certainly Joe Goldberg into my home via books and movies. I'm fine with that. So I don't know. But I think that draws us to an end for our discussion, at least on the fictional serial killer side. I know we have more planned in our next episode. And so we really hope you guys will join us for that one. And please reach out to us over social media or find us on our website. We also have an email address. So yeah, please reach out to us, because we would love to hear from you guys and kind of hear your thoughts on why serial killers fascinate us. Talk to you next time.